This is the Bounce Back Generation podcast.
But there's the potential for you to see that kind of inner golden heart of your kid and for them to see that inside of you. And that's where the authentic interaction starts. That's when you break down and start crying and say, I'm just so freaking scared right now. And then they start to cry and say, I don't know what the hell I was doing. It's not like you can do that on call every time when two people's armors are activated, but that's kind of the end game or the goal that's possible if you can get past it.
Are the kids all right today? There's a lot of scary news right now about how vulnerable young people are to anxiety, depression, and loneliness. Parents, teachers, and anyone who works with and cares about kids needs some guidance. I'm Jennifer Dillon, the director of Bounce Back Generation. We're a nonprofit providing media, tools, and training to help kids understand the basics of healthy mental and emotional growth. Joining us today is Dr. Sam Himelstein. Sam Himelstein is a licensed psychologist and the founder of both Family Spring, a mental health company that leverages technology to serve teens, young adults, and their families who've been impacted by substance use disorder and related mental health challenges, and the Center for Adolescent Studies, an interdisciplinary training institute focused on trauma-informed care, mindfulness, substance use disorder, resilience, and related training for professionals. For over 15 years, Dr. Himelstein has worked with incarcerated, trauma-impacted, and substance-using populations, and has had the mission to help adolescents and young adults thrive by becoming aware of the power of self-awareness and transformation. A formerly incarcerated youth himself, Dr. Himelstein was privileged to change his life from a path of drugs, violence, crime, and self-destruction to that of healing and transformation. We're really glad to have him here. I want to start with asking you what's happening to kids nowadays. I've just read so many articles. There are lots of different theories at COVID. There seems to be more maybe neurodivergence being diagnosed, or is it just social media? Or do you think that maybe we're looking at the issue of adolescent or young people's mental health the right way?
I think to answer your first question, it's probably a combination of a lot of things. Of course, there's a lot of research that showed that COVID has had a really adverse impact on teen mental health. The adolescent life stage just in and of itself can sometimes be tumultuous. Some adolescents have very smooth teen life stages, but some of them don't. When that is combined with something like COVID, when it's combined with mental health challenges, when it's combined with, you mentioned social media and where we're at with that, all of those things can really come together and contribute to what we're seeing right now, which is a lot of young people who are struggling with depression, anxiety, trauma, substance use, and things like that. The question of whether we're getting it right, I think the answer to that is probably not. If you look at mass scale, we still don't teach youth what healthy relationships are when they're young. We don't teach youth how to communicate with their peers. We don't teach youth how to think about their own possible mental health issues and ask for help. We're not putting things in place that could actually help with skill development and capacity building that would be in many ways preventative measures. On the mental health side, access to care is still really tough. It's hard to afford. It's hard to find a therapist right now. If you're going through your insurance, it's even harder to find a therapist right now because not as many people accept insurance. And the people who do accept insurance are completely full. As you know, I'm the CEO of a mental health company called Family Spring, and we're a primarily insurance-based and contract-based company. And we have lots of people calling us every day. And although we're a big group, we have about 20 clinicians with us and we're steadily growing. Those slots get filled up fast. And it can be really tough to hear, hey, I can put you on the waiting list and I'll do my best to get you in. And it might be 3 to 6 months from now. That's hard to hear as a teen, as a parent, as a young adult, because you don't need help in 6 months. You need help right now. So we've made some strides in the field, but there's a very, very long way to go.
I want to tell you what my mom friends and I talk about. Actually, I went out last night for dinner with two friends, and I think a lot of the conversation we have about our kids is, am I making what my kid is doing seem like it's abnormal? In other words, there's this like range of behavior that, although it feels dysfunctional, in a lot of ways, if you step back and you look at why they're behaving that way after they have gone through COVID and they get multiple messages every day from their phone telling them how the world is so screwed up,
Mhm.
and then they also get messages from friends and non-friends that are critical of them because they're doing social media interactions. And then you step back and say, well, if I was 13, 14, 15, 16 years old, whatever, and that was all happening to me, I think I would have some reactions to that that might actually look like what my kid is doing. So the question is, where do you know what the line is between dysfunction
Mhm.
versus, oh, my child has a mental health condition?
It's a good question. One of kind of the bars that we use in the mental health field is, and this would be for kids, adults, it is what they're doing getting in the way of their everyday functioning. So for you and I, that would be like, is it getting in the way of us being able to do our jobs, to show up to work, to be productive? We have good days, we have bad days. But if I'm struggling to the point where I can't get out of bed and I'm like missing work, that's an issue, right? For young people, that we would replace work with school. Is it getting in the way of them doing their normal thing? That's not the only way we would evaluate that, but that's one way. And as a parent, that's something that you can ask yourself is, are they reacting to having a behavioral outburst because they're depressed, because they're seeing all these things in the news? Also, maybe they were going through a breakup, or this is happening, or that is happening. But they're still like getting up and going to school every day. Just there's more arguments at home, let's say. So, does that mean they couldn't use therapy? Does that mean they couldn't benefit from help? No, they could always for sure benefit from help. And that could be therapy, that could be something else. But to the point where it's getting to be like a mental health disorder or a condition or a challenge that's diagnosable, we start to look at, is it getting in the way of regular everyday life? Regular, I'm putting in air quotes, regular being the everyday daily activities that they're responsible for doing. So that's just one way to think about it. With that being said, I've definitely worked with my fair share of young people in our practice, but also just me personally, who have had everything buttoned up and they do everything right. And still a lot is going on inside of them, and they fit criteria for mental health challenges that we would treat formally through treatment. Oftentimes that would be the difference between what's called an externalizing behavior and an internalizing behavior. An externalizing behavior is like they're having outbursts, being disruptive, things like that. That's the kid in class that's being the class clown, the one who's talking back to you at home, who's running away, who's really pushing the boundary. Internalizing behaviors are like feeling anxiety and depression.
Mm,
And feeling anxiety and depression, just because you're able to wake up and go to work and go to school every day, it doesn't mean that it's not extreme. It
yeah.
can be super extreme to the point where you can't wake up and go to work and school every day. And that's why that's one of the things we look for, but it's not the only thing.
I mean, that's one of the things that I think strikes fear in the heart of a parent when you hear of the kid who you thought was just like doing great and seemed everything was seems great in their life, and then you find out that they attempted suicide
Yeah.
out of the blue, nobody knew,
Hmm.
or they were caught in school with the gun, and you just don't know.
Yeah.
That's really
That's one of the scariest things to go through as a parent. And what I tell people is it's never too late to start building your relationships with your kids. And Dan Siegel wrote a book called, I can't remember if the book was called Be Present or Presence or something like that. It's around here somewhere. But anyways, the main point of the book is just show up as a parent. We're going to get things right. We're going to get things wrong. The more you show up, the more you're going to be involved in your kid's life, and the less likelihood that happening is going to be completely out of left field. It still may
Hmm.
happen, but you may start to see some of the signifiers of that early on rather than just get blindsided by some news like that. And if
Yeah.
that does happen, if you do get blindsided by some news like that, it's very important, especially for something like that. Getting caught with a gun, a suicide attempt, that's like automatic. You want to go to a treatment professional and start working through that as soon as possible. As a parent, it can be very natural to get reactive. You should get reactive. What's important is what actually comes out, how that's manifesting. Oftentimes people will get angry. I work with a lot of parents where it's understandable that if they get caught with drugs or a gun or something like that, their parents get really angry. It's also, I see a lot of times when they find out their kid is suicidal, they also get angry. Now, it doesn't happen all the time, but when that does happen, I work with a lot of parents just to help them uncover, hey, that anger, oftentimes that's covering up something, some deep vulnerability, some deep fear,
Fear.
which is completely normal in that situation.
Hmm.
And learning how to access that fear is important because if you're just reactive with anger, there's a likelihood that you could create more impasses, more ruptures, which could only isolate them more, which could make matters worse.
Yeah.
Just because you do access that fear and I'm scared right now, and it may not be good to react with anger, that's good. That's like an authentic experience that you can have as a parent. It also doesn't mean there's no boundaries. It also
Hmm.
doesn't mean you just say, "Hey, I'm really scared right now," but you can still go out Friday night and do whatever you're going to do. There's still boundaries in those situations as well, and that's why having some form of a guide, a therapist, a coach, or something like that. You don't always need that. Maybe you have a really close knit friend group who's been through it and they have some particular expertise in that. Therapy is not the catch-all, it's not the end-all be-all, but it can be helpful, particularly with people who have experience and expertise in working with youth and their families.
Can you talk a little bit about some of the things that you offer, some of the tools that you offer? And I know our team has done some trainings with your organization. I think as parents, we desperately need that. It's a lot to balance. I want to do boundaries and I want to understand where your behavior is coming from. And then I got to look at myself and
Yeah,
say, this is the fear that I have because I saw this happen in my family when I was 12 years old and I don't want it to happen to you. And
right.
it's a constellation of chaos.
That's a really good way to put it, actually. And it really speaks to how hard it can be to manage all of this, particularly your point of, I want to have boundaries. I want to build relationship and support my kids. I want them to be healthy. And I still have my wounds, my traumas, whatever I've been through as an individual. And that influences that whole dynamics one way or another, whether it's conscious or unconscious. A lot of things we find ourselves doing in terms of skill development, both with parents and our clients, is we help them become self aware. We help them practice self awareness. We all have the capability to be self aware, but it's also a practice. So we teach mindfulness, we teach other self awareness practices, other present moment practices to really be able to access the moment, because the moment is really the doorstep to who do I want to be in this moment? How do I want to show up in this moment? Your kid walks in from let's say curfew's 10 o'clock on a Friday or something like that. They walk in at 1 a.m. You suspect they're inebriated. You heard them drive into the driveway. So you're thinking they were driving drunk or driving inebriated. And you start to get extremely activated and extremely triggered and angry. And again, that's normal. That's okay. The anger oftentimes is covering up a defense against the fear of, I don't want to lose my kid. I don't want them to be in an accident. I don't want them to get arrested and lose their license and have a record. And now that's a situation we deal with all the time. Now, if you add the layer of, when I was growing up, my brother got arrested for a DUI, or my aunt got killed by a drunk driver or something like that. Now there's a whole nother layer that makes it exponentially harder for you as that individual to modulate, to regulate in that moment, right?
Hmm.
So part of it is self-awareness of like ongoing, whether that's therapy or we teach people reflective time. Who do you want to be in this journey? And let's be aware of all of these things. That's the insight side. The other side is what you're talking about, the skills. What do I actually do in the moment? That's the hardest thing, because when you're super triggered, this part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, oftentimes gets compromised, and it's difficult to think straight. And you're reacting from your emotional brain, limbic system reaction. And so when that happens, it's very, very difficult to do what you said you were going to do with your therapist. For example, you're working on some type of strategy for when your kid comes home drunk, and you're like, yeah, this is great, this is wonderful. And then it happens and all that stuff goes out the
Out the
window, right?
window, right?
Because you're activated. And that's a normal response, a normal response to fear. So that's why it's a practice, right? Like everybody can be in the moment. You can bring your awareness to the moment right here and now as we're talking. Everybody has access to that, with some very rare, unique circumstances for people who can't do that. Learning to practice that over time brings us to the doorstep to the present moment. That's why we teach mindfulness. We have a number of different kind of mediums to help bring people to the moment, so that they can then ask themselves, who do I want to be in this moment? How do I want to show up? I want to show up with a little bit of fierceness, but also some love. Because again, boundaries are important, right? That is a very dangerous thing for somebody to do, to come home after driving drunk. The key is that you may say to yourself, I want to tell this person how scary that was, if you can get past all of your anger, right? The key is that you're doing it consciously. And although all of that goes out the window, you can get better at it.
I just learned this recently, that when I get triggered and I feel really angry, is to try to remember that anger is a secondary emotion. And I showed that to my son too. And so that hopefully we remember, because we both have the same kind of really intense anger at each other. We can be yelling at each other and all that. And if we can just remember, this is a secondary emotion, there's something else going on underneath. And whether it's he or me, underneath is some kind of fear and vulnerability. You're getting close to something that is really painful for me, and I'm putting up the shield of anger and rage in order to keep you away from it. And it makes you love the person too, because you don't see the anger, you see the little boy inside, or maybe he looks at me and sees like a younger me inside saying, I'm afraid and I'm vulnerable. And then hopefully
Absolutely.
they don't try to step on that little person inside, which
They
sometimes
might.
teenagers do, because
Yeah,
they,
they might, but they might do that, but that's the risk that's important to
that's
take
why
and be
you're the
careful.
grown up in the room.
Exactly. Exactly. It's a good practice which you described, because it points to this idea that anger, sometimes other emotions too, they can be the armor. Other interpersonal dynamics too can be the armor that we shield ourselves with. And oftentimes when, young person comes home, you get activated for whatever reason, they also get activated too. And their armor that they've learned in their short life gets activated. And then you have two people's armors and shields interacting with each other. And it's not as much of an authentic interaction as one might think, because it's just your triggered reaction versus their triggered reaction. And when you remind yourself of, yeah, this could be a secondary emotion, one of the things you're doing there is disarming it, right? And there's a number of ways you can disarm your anger and your emotions, and that's one of them. Like, ask yourself a question: is this a secondary emotion? Am I covering something up? Again, really hard to do that when you're extremely angry, but you can get good at it. It is a skill you can develop. And when you do that, like you said, there's the potential for compassion to arise. There's the potential for empathy to arise. There's the potential for you to see that kind of inner golden heart of your kid, and for them to see that inside of you. And that's where the authentic interaction starts. That's when you break down and start crying and say, I'm just so freaking scared right now. And then they start to cry and say, I don't know what the hell I was doing. It's not like you can do that on call every time when two people's armors are activated, but that's kind of the end game, or the goal that's possible if you can get past it. So no, that's a great practice. Anything we can do to disarm our emotions can be really positive. It's one of the things that makes us human, but oftentimes they are things that arise inside of us and then pass away. You are not your anger. My anger, when it arises inside of me, it isn't the totality of who Sam is. It's an experience I'm having. And maybe it's a repetitive experience, but it's not the totality of who I am. And that goes for anxiety, for depression, all of that. That's
And
another way we teach mindfulness and teach insight oriented disidentification from our inner experiences.
so in that parent-child interaction, you don't need to have both people aware. Like if the parent is the one who's saying, I see that my child's rage and he's breaking things or whatever he's doing, he's yelling at me or whatever, and I can see that that's covering up a fear and a vulnerability, that in itself can be a new way of addressing the issue instead of both people getting angry. But
Yes.
what I want to ask you about our nervous system, because I know you do
Mhm.
this process called stick, which I want you to explain at some point. But it occurred to me that if you look at, we talk about the five things that are nervous system reactions. So we always know about the fight response and flight response and freeze. But we
Mhm.
also talk about fainting, the faint response, and the fawn response. And fawn being like people pleasing and yes, I'll do whatever. And what I find interesting is I would say a lot of interactions that I see with my son is that a lot of times my nervous system response is meeting another nervous system response. So for example,
Yes.
the kid comes home and they're whatever, they're late or they didn't clean their room or I got a call from the school, whatever. And so I'm angry. So I have the fight response. I just want to have it out and what's going on. And the child might respond with a flight response. I'm out of here, walks out the door. Or the faint response, I'm just going to go to my room and fall asleep. I get that a lot,
Mhm.
things like
Mhm.
that. And so, can you talk about that and our nervous system and how they interact with each other and how do we understand them so that we can also see what's going on with our kid as well and understanding how the nervous system works?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you touched on a bit of it, right? Like, and I think it's one thing that's important to disclaim real quick is there's still a lot to be learned. There's still a long way to go. So I just want everybody to kind of take what we're talking about slightly with a grain of salt. Like, you're right that you could be in fight, somebody else could be in flight. One thing that to focus on though is the behavior, right? You're revved up, they're revved down. You can
Mm-hmm.
see that
Right.
despite what may or may not be going on with their nervous system. But it is true, the working hypothesis is that the neural correlates of what we were just talking about before, the armor, might be the behavioral manifestation and the conditioning that you learn over time. And its root may be in your physiological response the first number of times you had that experience. So, for example, if you grow up in a violent household and your physiological response is the fight response, and you get hyper aroused and mobilized and start fighting a lot, over time, that fight response turns into behavioral conditioning. You become disruptive, confrontive, you fight a lot, those sorts
It
of
becomes
things,
your
right?
personality
Yeah,
almost.
absolutely. Intimately wounding and traumas and those early experiences, of course, absolutely intimately intertwined with who you are and who you become, right? And so if that happens in the example that you were talking about where you're getting revved up and for whatever reason your child in that circumstance has been conditioned to feign and to just like pass out and go to sleep, that they did that because maybe they did it once or twice or a number of times and it worked, meaning like there's no more argument, they don't have to deal with it anymore. That could be related to specific physiological things that are happening inside of them. It could also just be a behavioral manifestation and condition that gets reinforced. But also, whether or not you want to kind of geek out about the brain and the autonomic nervous system and the polyvagal theory or any of those things, the fact of the matter is that when somebody gets extremely triggered into rage or from their trauma, it is difficult for them to think straight, to walk straight, to
Mm-hmm.
talk straight. It's difficult for them to learn something. We can see that in our interactions with them. And that's the thing that I kind of stress with parents, although I will say learning about the brain, all of those things is very important. I think it's a good thing. That's just more the psychoeducation for the parent.
Mm-hmm.
I do think though that over time, those physiological responses to threat, to deep concern, to anger, all of those things. If they do get conditioned, I do see them having those correlates with those behavioral conditions and manifestations that happen over time, whether it's that person that you're describing becomes conflict avoidant, and that kind of over time becomes a part of their personality. When they start to get into arguments, conflict, or something like that, if that's been reinforced or for the better part of their life, they might naturally start to get tired, for example. That's how they check out, rather than the opposite of that, which, like myself, when I get activated, I check in. I want to fight more. I want to argue. But
Right.
those are just different styles. Whether you're the teen, the parent, an individual adult, just gaining self-awareness of yourself, it's all about the insight around, how do I show up in these moments? And does it work for me? I've worked with a mom before who was a yeller, and she really had to take a hard look in the mirror and say, I think I'm the one in the family system that's contributing to a lot of the toxicity. When the toxicity arises, of course, she loves her children, her husband, all of that. It was a habit, and it came from her trauma, which was extreme. So sometimes it's taking a hard look in the mirror and saying, how is this serving me?
Yeah.
And if it's not serving me, can I deactivate it? And if it is serving me at times, because sometimes it may be important for your style to serve you or to serve the environment, can I activate it? But do it consciously rather than unconsciously.
One of the things that we do is put a lot of messaging on social media. And there seems to be two camps that have developed on social media when it comes to people talking to young people about their mental health. And one side seems to be very into nervous system regulation, and the other side seems to be more into psychology. Is there a difference?
That's a great question. I don't know if I know the answer to that because I'm not on social media as much, but that fascinates me. I'd love to pull up your account and see what you see. For my quick gut reaction to what you're saying, without seeing most of that, is it's all good if it's good content. I mean, of course, if it's not harmful content, if it's like, hey, here's how your nervous system works and this is what the fight and flight is, and if you get really stressed out, here's some ways to calm your nervous system down. Or on the other side, if it's more psychology, this is what a self-limiting belief is, here's how to catch it.
That's such a good point, because I think what all of those things do is at least start to give parents, kids a language so that they can approach a therapist or know, hey, I need a therapist and it's time to.
Yeah.
I have a question. What would be some advice that you could give to teachers, social workers, parents, of course, even therapists, on how to motivate a young person to do some of that work that you were talking about around self-awareness? And you get to design your own life. You're the inventor of your life, so get to know yourself, all that. What are some of the ways that you motivate kids? Because a lot of times you'll get like, oh yeah, whatever.
You're going to get a range of motivation right off the bat. And if someone has low motivation, it's going to be harder. One quick tip of advice before I get into the real answer is, if somebody is resistant or has very low motivation, it's going to be harder, and it's okay to accept that. It doesn't mean you give up. We don't give up, but just know that. And when you accept that and walk into that relationship that way, you'll know it's going to be a little bit harder with this person as opposed to somebody who's, I'm really motivated to learn from you. That's just like any relationship though, right? And so the deeper thing is, build a relationship. Build an authentic relationship. I know that's way easier said than done. I know some people's time constraints make that difficult. I know some people's jobs make that difficult. It's different for a therapist than it is for a teacher, than it is for a parent, obviously, right? But it's so incredibly important. And the reason is because the relationship itself can be healing, but the real pragmatic use of it is, if you can create an authentic relationship, is an emotionally safe relationship. It's a healthy boundaried relationship, but it's an emotionally safe relationship. If you can create an authentic relationship with somebody over time, they will be more open to what you have to offer. You talked about wanting to hear about one of our techniques, STICK, which stands for stop, take a breath, imagine the future, and choose, right? It's a mindfulness-based cognitive acronym that we've found to be helpful with youth, not when they're triggered from their trauma, because this part of the brain is off and it's cognitive by nature, but when they have a decision to make, when their friends call them and text them and say, hey, let's go party tonight. We rented a hotel when they're 16 or something like that, which was a little fishy, right? They have time. They have time to think about it. They have time to make a decision, right? How do we get somebody to actually buy into that? Because most of the time when we teach kids that, they might be like, I don't know, that's probably not going to work for me. But what we find is that if we build an authentic relationship with them, they're like, I'll try this out because Sam said so. They don't have to be like extremely excited at 10 out of 10 for it. They just need to be ambivalent about it, you know, not like resistant, as in like, oh no, I'm definitely not doing that, or more just like, oh, whatever. I don't think that thing's going to help me, but on the other hand, I trust you, so I'll give it a try. And then they give it a try, and then it may be helpful. And if it's not helpful, you still have the relationship to leverage to try other things. That's the main tip that I would give people. Work on building relationships. Think about how you can do that. Think about your own relationships, how they develop organically. That's going to be my next book that I write, Building Authentic Relationships. There's courses out there. There's books out there. Educate yourself. Listen to podcasts like this and put intentionality into it. And know that just because you're doing that, it doesn't mean it's always going to work out. We can't control the other person, you know? The thing that you can do is think, who is in my community that can help this person? Because maybe they're open to somebody else in the community, another teacher, another therapist, another parent. Maybe they're open to that relationship. That's an important piece of this as well. So that's my kind of like parting advice to parents, to people, to providers who work with anybody, really, because it doesn't just work with teens, it works with anybody. And that's why I'm passionate about writing another book. Our first book, actually, I'm writing it with a colleague. It's not going to be just for teens. It's going to be very broad. How do we build authentic relationships? Because again, it's like kids don't get taught that. Adults say they know how to do that, but it just comes from experience. And really what's happening is we're just mimicking our conditioning of whatever we learned through osmosis or consciously or whatever growing up. So I just think it's really to bring some awareness to that, because when people have healthy, authentic relationships in their life, everything gets better.
That's huge.
Everything gets better.
This segues into the final question. We always ask people when they come on the podcast to tell us who made a difference for you when you were growing up.
Overwhelmingly, great question, by the way, overwhelmingly people that come to mind is my parents, my dad, particularly just because he was heavily involved. I was in and out of the justice system. I was in and out of group homes. I was arrested many, many times as a very, very young teen, really 6th grade through 9th grade. And he was always there. There's just no substitute for that. In terms of a provider, though, who was not my family member, there was a guy who was the director of the last group home that I lived in when I was in the 9th grade. And he was an ex-Army Ranger, grew up in East LA, had a seriously traumatizing life, and just started giving back to kids. And he was a boxer. He would wake me up in the mornings at the group home. We would do boxing training. That relationship was the first professional relationship where I was like, I trust this person. And so therefore, I'm going to trust what he has to say. And that completely influenced my frame when I became a therapist and a healer and a mentor. Then, of course, it was like growing up and reflecting on the relationship with the parents and how much of a staple pillar how that impacted me. Because, as a parent, it's like kids oftentimes don't fully comprehend that in the moment. So those two folks, my dad and this individual, were really instrumental in my path for sure.
I can't help but ask one more question, because I think people can be asking.
Sure.
Why do you think you went off kind of the deep end at that age?
It's a good question. I get asked that every once in a while. Sometimes I have a good answer, sometimes not. So we'll see where this goes. Energy-wise, I always was a boundary pusher. So authority, that kind of quintessential, like a kind of corny, I rebelled against authority. There was some truth to that for sure. Fairness was a big deal for me when I was very young and not seeing that in certain aspects of my life. So that being just kind of like a kind of rambunctious, tumultuous, physical kid, along with some early tough experiences, some early wounding, I would say, not necessarily from my parents or inside the home, but just with, I had some tough experiences with police officers when I was very young, like 11 years old, 10, 11 years old, that very much influenced my frame of authority. I had some tough experiences with teachers at a very, very young age as well, and tough experiences with my parents as well. Just never to the level that I would consider like a trauma or something like that. Because again, my parents were always there. They never gave up on me. And just something inherent too, I think, inside of me that's always been searching for something in this life. And I still feel that. I've just learned how to channel that energy. And that provider, the one I was telling you about, his name was Gabriel, him training me in boxing and also, of course, the therapy things, right? He was an MSW by training. He wasn't licensed, but he ran a group home. So it was more like mentoring. It was a highly influential time in my life for learning essentially self-awareness and emotional intelligence at such a young age. That helped me channel a lot of what I was feeling inside of me. When I left that last group home, I still struggled, but never in high school, and struggled with alcohol and fighting and things like that, but never to the extent of what it was before. My identity had changed. I don't go to jail anymore. That's just not something I do. Of course, you can get in a fight and hurt somebody and go to jail, but to me back then, that was just a different bucket of life. And so I struggled a little bit when I got home, but by the time I got to college, I had really honed it in. And I also learned meditation when I was there as well. And at a young age, that's why I became so passionate about teaching mindfulness and meditation to young people.
Yeah.
Because I was like, this to me, I didn't ever want to become a monk. Boxing and martial arts were a doorstep to meditation. And to me, it was just working out for the mind and self-discipline. And that's really what I leaned into. So all of that kind of helped me formulate or helped me become the person who I am and I'm still becoming. It's hard though. You go back in your mind and you think about were there other specific experiences that like kind of led me astray? And this is no knock on my parents, but I just think a part of the time it was like, I always say, like, in my day, we never watched TV. We played outside all day. That's how it was for me. And that was great. And there are some cons to that, like meaning there was no supervision. So the first time I smoked weed, for example, when I was like 11 years old, is because I was out all day on my own.
That's right.
Again, not to take away from the fact that we are way too addicted as a society to our tablets and phones and things like that. And, probably scareder than we were when I was in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade, when I could just walk to the park totally by myself, no phone, no way for my parents to track me other than they just know I'm going to the park. There is a wisdom and a blessing and a learning in that. And of course, there's also disadvantages to it as well.
Yes.
My son is 12 right now. He's obsessed with basketball, and I love every second of sharing that with him. And I'm just like, I can't believe where I was at his age and where he's at. Like, I remember talking to my wife, but I'll just share with you briefly. I remember talking to my wife. She was really worried about certain, not like learning developmental disabilities with him, but he was like behind in reading. He slurred his speech. I was like, he definitely gets that from me. Certain things like that, normal parent things to be worried about. And I looked at her one day early on, and this was because he's in the 6th grade right now. In the 4th grade, I was like, he hasn't cussed out his teacher, and he's in the 4th grade. That's a win for me. By the time I was in the 4th grade, I was getting suspended for cussing out my teacher. He's in the 6th grade. He's obsessed with basketball. To our knowledge, knock on wood, he's never come home high. I like to at least think if he did, I would, given my expertise and all my experience, not just personally, but professionally, of course, I would have some hints, right? We have a good relationship with him. We're not getting into arguments every day. I love the kid. I love hanging out with him, right? I'm in awe in where he's at, and also mortifies me. Wow, there are kids his age at his school who are going through what I went through. And so it's scary out there. It's all the reason to just come back to why we're doing this podcast. It's all the reason to do the inner work and to do the work of being a parent, a caregiver, a provider, because you can make that difference in somebody's life. Even if if you have teenagers, young people listening to this podcast, you can make a difference in the lives of your peers that are struggling,
Or your younger
sometimes even a
siblings.
bigger difference.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think for a lot of kids, they learn more from their peers
Yes,
after a certain age than they do from their parents. Yeah.
totally. Absolutely.
Well, that's a beautiful story, actually. I just want to say that the way I kind of see it sometimes is that you were like this, and I see that a lot of kids, that they have this bigness in them and they
Yeah.
can't handle it. They don't know how to put it all into place. And
Right.
you were fortunate to have the parents that you had and have the
Yeah.
experiences you had that helped you to take that power and start to figure out how to channel it. And I suspect that there are millions of kids out there that just need that information.
Right.
So
Absolutely.
that's
And need that outlet too, that the information, the relationship, and the outlet to channel that bigness.
and we need them because the world's a messed up place.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thanks
sure.
again.
Thanks for listening. This is the Bounce Back Generation podcast. Thank you to our guest, Dr. Sam Himelstein. Our producer is Liam Donaldson. Music by Jogging Turtle. Please subscribe to this podcast. It helps us to do the work we do as a nonprofit. You'll find that our other podcasts are equally as interesting. They're about relationships, grief, anger, creating your own heroic life story. If you'd like to learn more about us, visit our website at bouncebackgeneration.org or our media site at bbgtv.org. Or you can follow us on Instagram at bouncebackgeneration, TikTok at bouncebackgen. If you have a story you'd like to share about your own journey to emotional resilience, please contact us at info@bouncebackgeneration.org or call and leave a message at 415-570-8765.